Frank Dux convinced the world that he was one of the most dangerous men on the planet, a warrior supposedly capable of knocking out 56 opponents in a row and striking faster than the blink of an eye. Dux is possibly the most elaborate fraud in martial arts history. But how bad was Frank Dux actually? According to Dux, the Kumite was a secret underground tournament held in the Bahamas, a brutal single-elimination competition with 60 rounds, no weight classes, and virtually no rules. First man to go down lost, and according to his own story, in 1975, he became the first Westerner to ever win the tournament. His alleged records in the Kumite were anything but modest. 56 consecutive knockouts in a single tournament. He also claimed to have achieved the fastest knockout ever recorded in combat sports history, just 3.2 seconds after the fight began. And as if that weren't enough, Dux insisted he possessed the fastest punch ever measured in a human being, 0.12 seconds. To put these elaborate claims into perspective, the best punch speed measurements of elite fighters during that era placed world-class boxers somewhere between 0.25 and 0.4 seconds. Muhammad Ali, in his prime, reportedly hovered around 0.3 seconds, while Roy Jones Jr., considered one of the fastest fighters in history, was measured at roughly 0.31 seconds. If Frank Dux's claims were true, that would mean he was nearly 3 times faster than some of the greatest boxers on earth. He also claimed he could fight blindfolded. Those stories and those numbers were enough to get Hollywood's attention. There was just one problem. Actually, several problems. A 60-round single-elimination tournament is mathematically impossible. To have 60 elimination rounds, you would need more than 1 trillion participants. Not even Dux himself could properly explain this when people pointed it out. Even if Dux actually meant 60 fights instead of 60 rounds, the physical toll of fighting 60 times in a single weekend against supposedly the best fighters in the world is biologically impossible. And there's another issue. If this tournament really had 60 rounds, that would mean Dux personally fought and knocked out almost every opponent in the entire event. Not even the most brutal Vale Tudo tournaments in Brazil or the legendary 100-man Kumite in Kyokushin Karate have ever produced knockout statistics remotely close to that. The statement from Kenneth Wilson of the Bahamas Ministry of Sports was essentially the official death blow to Dux's story. The Bahamas is a relatively small island nation where major events spread quickly. Organizing a secret international martial arts tournament involving hundreds of fighters, infrastructure, accommodations, security, and transportation, all without the Ministry of Sports or local authorities knowing, is pure fantasy. Wilson publicly stated that it was impossible for a martial arts tournament of that scale to have secretly taken place in the country. This may be the most embarrassing detail of all. Dux displayed a trophy that he claimed had been awarded to him after winning the Kumite. But when journalists investigated, they found the receipt. Frank Dux had personally purchased the trophy base from a local trophy shop. The store itself produced the receipt as evidence. Frank Dux literally bought his own world champion trophy. As more inconsistencies piled up, Dux's stories came under heavier and heavier scrutiny until eventually one unavoidable question emerged. Did he ever actually prove any of his claims inside a real ring against legitimate fighters? This is where Frank Dux's story becomes complicated in a very specific way. A man who claims to be the deadliest warrior on Earth should be able to prove it, not in a secret tournament, not in a classified operation, but in a room, in front of a camera, against a real opponent. And Frank Dux had opportunities to do exactly that. But the outcome was always the same. In multiple documented television appearances and public events throughout the 80s and 90s, Dux demonstrated technique, knowledge of forms, reasonable speed for a man his age, decent coordination. But what he never demonstrated was the ability to actually fight. Legitimate martial artists invited him to compete under controlled and verifiable conditions. Dux always had a reason not to show up. An injury, a scheduling conflict, Or the classic explanation, that his training was too deadly to safely demonstrate. It's the exact same pattern seen with Steven Seagal and Ashita Kim. It's the trademark excuse of the martial artist who claims to be so dangerous that proving it would supposedly kill someone. The convenience of that excuse is almost perfect. And that's exactly what makes it so suspicious. When journalists from the Los Angeles Times investigated Frank Dux in 1988, they didn't just speak with government officials or examine military records. They also spoke with legitimate martial artists. And the assessment was unanimous in its simplicity and brutality. Dux clearly knew karate, probably some form of Japanese karate, possibly Shotokan or something similar. He had the physical vocabulary of someone who had trained. But the level he described, the records he claimed, and the speed he supposedly possessed belonged to an entirely different category from anything anyone could actually observe in him. Gene LeBell, the legendary judoka and wrestler, often called the most dangerous man in the world, based on documented achievements, spoke generally about the kind of claims Dux was making. His position was simple. Anyone claiming to strike in 0.12 seconds should be able to prove it with a standard speed measurement device. The fact that nobody ever saw Dux do it says everything. Chuck Norris, meanwhile, actually had a documented competitive career. He publicly won the professional middleweight karate champion title in 1968, and his tournament records exist because they happened in front of real audiences, real referees, and real opponents. The difference between Chuck Norris and Frank Dux isn't just honesty. It's competitive courage. Norris fought legitimate opponents in legitimate tournaments and built his reputation on verifiable victories. Dux built his legend around secret tournaments nobody could confirm. And the irony becomes even greater once Jean-Claude Van Damme enters the story. The man who portrayed Frank Dux in Bloodsport actually had legitimate karate and kickboxing experience in Europe, along with documented competitive records of his own. In other words, a real martial artist had to bring Frank Dux to life in order to make his stories seem believable and make the myth even bigger. To be fair though, the entire story at least helped the muscles from Brussels launch his career when he needed it most. If you think Van Damme delivered an iconic performance as Frank Dux in Bloodsport, leave a like on the video and subscribe. Continuing on. Because we still need to examine just how much fiction and how many outright lies were hiding behind Frank Dux's supposedly superhuman speed. This specific claim is worth examining more closely because the number itself is incredibly revealing. A punch delivered in 0.12 seconds would mean Dux's fist traveled the full extension of the arm in that amount of time. For the average human arm, that's roughly 60 centimeters of movement. Biomechanics experts who have studied human punching speed generally agree on one thing. Under laboratory conditions, using highly precise measuring equipment, the fastest documented punches from elite athletes typically range between 0.15 and 0.18 seconds, and that's from specialists specifically trained for explosive hand speed, not necessarily real combat. Frank Dux claimed he exceeded that limit by more than 20%. Without specialized speed training documentation, without verified laboratory testing, without measurable evidence of any kind. Just his word. And by that point, his word already had a very well-established reputation. Of all the abilities Frank Dux claimed to possess, fighting blindfolded was the most cinematic, and also the most difficult to maintain. Because unlike a secret tournament in the Bahamas, blindfolded fighting is something that can be demonstrated in any gym, at any time, in front of anyone willing to participate. And yet, Dux never demonstrated it under verifiable conditions. There were documented attempts to organize controlled demonstrations where experts could confirm that the blindfold was legitimate and the opponent was competent. Dux consistently declined. His most common excuse was that he supposedly couldn't control how lethal he became in that state. That the danger to the opponent was simply too high. The exact same Steven Seagal pattern I mentioned earlier, and honestly, it's incredible how similar it sounds. Within its own logic, it's an impossible claim to refute, and incredibly convenient for someone who can't actually do what they claim. This is the part that makes the Frank Dux story genuinely interesting, instead of simply tragic. Frank Dux was not a complete physical fraud. He was a fraud of scale. As a fight choreographer, his work on Bloodsport is functionally competent. The fight sequences have rhythm, visual clarity, and enough martial logic for the movie to work. That requires real knowledge of movement, timing, and how techniques translate on camera. His kata demonstrations, traditional karate forms, clearly show someone who genuinely trained for years. You cannot fake the kind of muscle memory visible in those movements. And by most accounts, his ability to teach and communicate martial concepts to students appears to have been real. Several former students described him as an effective instructor at the beginner and intermediate levels. The problem is not that Frank Dux knew nothing. The problem is the astronomical distance between what he could actually do and what he claimed he could do. He was a reasonably competent martial artist who presented himself as the deadliest human being on Earth. And that is a massive difference. Someone could argue, who cares if Dux exaggerated? Bloodsport is still a great movie. Jean-Claude Van Damme became a real star. The entertainment worked. But the real problem was the collateral damage Dux's claims caused inside the martial arts world itself. For years, the public's idea of what a martial arts master was supposed to be became distorted by people exactly like Dux. Students spent enormous amounts of money on instructors promising superhuman abilities built around the same formula. The secret tournament. The ancient master. The techniques too deadly to demonstrate without killing someone. Frank Dux's playbook became the blueprint for dozens of smaller frauds that followed after him. Less famous. Less cinematic. But just as expensive for the people who believed them. Frank Dux didn't just lie about his own abilities. He helped create an ecosystem where lying about martial arts skill became a profitable business model. So, how bad was Frank Dux as a martial artist? He was competent. He was not unstoppable. He was not the deadliest man on Earth. And he probably wasn't even the toughest fighter in his own neighborhood if he had been forced to prove it against someone willing to hit back. Frank Dux was a man with real but ordinary martial arts skills who built an extraordinary identity around the fact that nobody could enter the secret tournament to verify whether any of it was true. And for a while, it worked. It worked on Hollywood. It worked on the public. It even worked on Jean-Claude Van Damme. Until people started asking very simple questions. Where are the records? Where are the witnesses? Where is the trophy? And Frank Dux, perhaps the most imaginative martial arts fraud of all time, could never answer those questions without inventing another story. The world's deadliest warrior turned out to be dangerous only to the truth. And in that fight, he never lost. If the first video left you wondering how fake Dux really was, now you also know how bad he actually was. And if you still haven't seen that first video, I've got it waiting for you right here. Don't forget to support the channel with your valuable like and subscribe, and I'll see you in that video. Thanks for watching.